Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thank you guys for being here as always, and today we got to do some headcanoning for Rebels. Now keep in mind, this is just my explanation. This isn't any sort of hard canon setup. This isn't theorizing even necessarily. I see it as a stopgap, an explanation inside of my head for what happened to these characters post season 4 of Rebels. At least until Lucasfilm ends up giving us a story in 6 months or a year or 5 years or 10 years or whatever it ends up being. So let's get right into it and talk about each character in the Rebels cast around season 4. First off, we can pretty much set aside Zeb, Kallus, Hera, Chopper. Their stories have pretty much been explained. We know that Zeb and Kallus retired on a nice place on New Lasan, whatever. Hera went on to become a general in the Rebellion and the New Republic, and Chopper went with her. The characters in real question are Ezra, Thrawn, Sabine, Jacen Syndulla, and Ahsoka. So let's start off with Ezra and Thrawn. For what it's worth, these two characters are the ones that I'm leaving as open-ended as possible. I am fully aware that that is a story that Lucasfilm plans on explaining, or rather a story that Lucasfilm plans on telling later on in the future. So I don't have any serious concrete explanation in my own head for what happened to these two characters. My assumption is that they ended up back in the unknown regions, and we're going to get at least a book or comic series or something that ends up explaining exactly what they're up to. What happens to Thrawn and Ezra is going to make for a very, very interesting story. And whether or not that's going to end up being something like Ezra and Thrawn end up being forced to team up, choosing to team up, to face a new threat that they're facing deep inside of the unknown regions, or whether or not that's going to mean Thrawn ends up waking up and Ezra is gone, and we get that story off to the side while Ezra is off doing something else. He's exploring the unknown regions. He's learning about all these new Force-using factions that have sprung up and exist out in the unknown regions, completely unknown to the rest of the galaxy. Now let's talk about Sabine's story arc. In my head, Sabine stayed on Lothal until around the Battle of Yavin, and then she became more free to do what she needed to do. As soon as there was a semblance of security for Lothal, she knew that the Empire wasn't going to waste its resources when it's in an all-out war for the rest of the galaxy. I think that she would have gone back to Mandalore, would have ensured that Mandalore was still safe, ensure that Mandalore is secure, ensure that Bo-Katan is doing all right. I think that she would have fought a little bit in that war, at least a little bit. The Mandalorian Civil War Part 18 or whatever it ends up being. And then bounces around the galaxy just doing what she does best, which is fighting and being a champion of the light, even if she isn't actually a Force user. And I'll touch on Sabine's post-epilogue story once we get to Ahsoka. But before we get to Ahsoka, I want to touch on Jacen Syndulla. It's pretty clearly hinted that Jacen Syndulla is the son of Kanan Jarrus, Caleb Doom, whatever, and Hera. And that raises the question, why didn't Jacen Syndulla end up going to work with Luke Skywalker, become a Padawan underneath Luke Skywalker? And I have 4 possible explanations. Number 1 is, yes, he does end up going with Luke Skywalker to join Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy on whatever unknown world it is, and he either died there when Ben Solo turned, or he ended up joining the Knights of Ren. Possible storyline number 2 for Jacen is that he chose not to do it. He didn't want to go on to become a Force user. He didn't want to become a Jedi. And I think that Hera, as a person, would never force anything on her kid. She is very much a free-spirited person, and she values individualism. So there's no way that she would have made Jacen Syndulla go off if Jacen Syndulla didn't want to go. Outcome number 3 is that Hera is fearful of losing Jason to the same fate that she lost Kanan. She doesn't want her son to die in some grand, noble, selfless sacrifice like his dad did. She doesn't want to lose her son to the Force the same way that she lost her lover, for lack of a better term. And possibility number 4 for Jason is, plain and simply, Luke Skywalker didn't have the time. It's been strongly suggested in a lot of the canon, both most prominently that springs to mind is Bloodline and the Last Jedi novelization, and I suppose also the campaign for Battlefront 2 suggests that Luke Skywalker spent probably about 10 to 20 years after Return of the Jedi not training anyone. At that point in time, he is concentrating on figuring out what is going on with the Jedi. What were the Jedi? What were their values? What were the opposing values of the Sith? What were the values of the Church of the Force? What are the values of the Ordo Aspectu, as mentioned in the comics? What are the values of this? What's the history of that? And so on and so forth. He didn't have time to do any training. And by the time that he actually started training people, he just didn't get around to picking up Jacen Syndulla. Keep in mind, especially once you look at like Broom Kid from The Last Jedi, there are probably thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not millions of Force-sensitive or potential Jedi out in the galaxy. Luke picked up a couple dozen of them at maximum and went to go and train with them, and Jacen Syndulla could have simply slipped through the cracks. All right, now for the big one, Ahsoka. So it's pretty heavily implied in the World Between Worlds episode that she is sent back to 2 years previous from when the actual episode itself is taking place. So essentially, she is alive and back on Malachor 3 years before the Battle of Yavin. And then she doesn't show up again until sometime after the Battle of Endor. At least that's what the epilogue implies. So what was she doing during that time? First off, before I get into any of my theories, I wanted to point you guys in the direction of my good friend Glenn's channel, Star Wars Reading Club. He did a really great video. It's about a 10-minute video. I'll leave a link of it down in the description below, where he discussed a lot about the whole Topps trading cards that were released at Celebration Europe, and he put a ton of thought into that video. I recommend you go and check it out. Now, just to piggyback off of Glenn's ideas, I do think that there's a strong possibility that Ahsoka's just not in the picture. She's busy. She's doing mystical, forcey stuff on Malachor. And we now know that the Force influences time just as much as it influences physical matter or the laws of physics. So it could just be messing with us. It could mess with things. She could go on this journey that only takes her 5 minutes, but it takes 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years or whatever it ends up being in our world in the main timeline. Dave Filoni even mentions in the Q&A for the Rebels season 4 finale that Ahsoka is on a bit of a journey in between the land of the living and the land of the dead. And so I'm getting some pretty strong Lord of the Rings vibes there. And I wouldn't be surprised, considering Dave's love of mythology and love of weird mystic Force stuff. Now, I do have 2 alternate theories. Both of them are a little bit more simple than the last one. Theory number 2 is that Ahsoka, it took her 10 years or whatever it is to scrounge up the parts of all of these ancient crashed craft in order to escape Malachor. She's kind of marooned there. Darth Vader thinks that she's dead. Anakin thinks that she's dead. And there were no more working ships left on Malachor, so she probably had to scrounge for parts in order to escape, so it just took her that long to get off of Malachor. Alternate theory number 3, which is at least the one that I'm going with personally, is that Ahsoka was trapped on Malachor 5 until a year or 2 years or 3 years after Return of the Jedi, when suddenly a mysterious ship comes and lands on Malachor, carrying Luke Skywalker looking for more Force knowledge. And that's how she gets off planet. That's at least my current headcanon until a story comes forth from Lucasfilm. I would love to imagine Ahsoka and Luke having a conversation about, you know, his father Anakin, her master Anakin, and she teaches him what she can about the Force, especially the Mortis stuff, which could lead into how he knew how to do his whole Force projection stuff in The Last Jedi. Now, let's go into what happened to Ahsoka and Sabine afterward. What happened to them after they left Lothal. Again, this is going to be much more nebulous than, say, Jason Syndulla's or Ahsoka and Sabine's explanations pre-Return of the Jedi. My standard working theory, until Lucasfilm ends up telling that story, and I am of the firm belief that they will be telling that story eventually, I'm assuming or guessing it'll be either in a novel or it will be in sort of anthology movie miniseries, something like that, on the direct-to-consumer streaming service that Disney's putting out, in which Ahsoka and Sabine go off to find Ezra and do bring him home, and at that point he ends up joining with Luke Skywalker and he's killed by Ben Solo. Meanwhile, Ahsoka is either being a nomad, continuing on kind of what her journey was in the Ahsoka novel, while Sabine goes off to Mandalore to continue to be either a general or a head of state after Bo-Katan steps down, or something of that nature. That's at least my assumption on what happened to these characters. And I think that about does it for me on my headcanoning for the end of Rebels, but I want to know what you guys think. Should they have already explained these things? Should they have had some comics already lined up and ready to be published before the end of Rebels? Or are you okay with them taking their time and kind of really thinking on how they wanted to end the story arcs, or rather continue the story arcs for these characters? I'm interested on your opinions on that. Please let me know down in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video and if it helped you at all, hit that like button. And if you're new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button for more videos like this one. Thank you guys as always, and may the Force be with you. Take care.